She, her, is the founder of Sozo Media, a collective of creative companies. Sozo Artists, a dynamic roster of artists in dance, music, spoken word, new media, and film, focused on innovation and social justice. Sozo Impact, a nonprofit organization dedicated to incubating work by BIPOC artists and producers. And Sozo Vision, a consultancy which partners with institutions to design social impact facing programs and strategies with clients ranging from Yale to the Apollo. Rika's work as a producer manager spans 2 decades and hundreds of live and digital projects with artists and organizations globally. So with Producer Hub celebrating the work of independent producers, thrilled to have such an amazing independent producer with such experience on our call. So thanks, Rika. Next, Emily Johnson, she, her, is an artist who makes body-based work. She is a land and water protector and an activist for justice, sovereignty, and well-being. A Bessie Award-winning choreographer, Guggenheim Fellow, and recipient of the Doris Duke Artist Award. She is based in Lenapehoking, also known as New York City. Emily is of the Yupik Nation and leading an advisory group developing a First Nations performing arts network, which I can selfishly say I'm very excited about because I'm part of the advisory group as well. So we're really thrilled to have Emily here today. And last but not least, we have the fabulous Andre Perry, who is the executive director of the Englert Theater in Iowa City. He co-founded and continues to produce Iowa City's Mission Creek Festival, a celebration of music and literature, as well as the multidisciplinary festival of creative process, Witching Hour. He is a writer and arts worker based in Iowa City. His debut nonfiction book, Some of Us Are Very Hungry Now, was hailed by NPR as extraordinary, and Forward called him a fresh American voice that demands to be heard. So we have a multi-talented gentleman with us here tonight. So before we go ahead and dive in, I wanted to get a working definition of force majeure going. This is going to be an expansive conversation, but wanted to just kind of make sure that we're all locked into what we're talking about tonight. So to get us started, in business circles, a force majeure clause in a contract describes those uncontrollable events such as war, labor stoppages, or extreme weather, or as many of us learned, COVID-19, that are not the fault of any party and that make it difficult or impossible to carry out normal business. A company may insert a force majeure clause into a contract to absolve itself from liability in the event it cannot fulfill the terms of a contract for reasons beyond its control. So while this has been a major topic right now in COVID times, this has really, for all of us on this phone call, and we talked about this a bit during our the conversation to get us set up for today, these issues with force majeure are not new to the time of COVID and have been around for some time. And we're gonna get that started. So yeah, and so the last thing I'll say before we kick it off to my fellow panelists is that we're going to try to just get into it and really talk about this conversation at the level that we've been having it in some rooms such as APAP, the Association of Performing Arts Presenters, Creating New Futures that Emily will talk about. But I really want to encourage everyone, if you have questions about what are you referring to drop it in the chat, because we really want this to be an accessible space. So please don't hesitate to shout out with questions and clarifications as we go. So the first question I wanted to offer to folks, for many, it's been seeming like force majeure has been a current hot button topic. But one of the things we talked about is that this contract is indicative of a larger set of issues. So I'm wondering if Rika, you wouldn't mind kicking us off and talking a little bit more about that.
Yes, Ronnie, and thanks for having me. If you can imagine a contract as a handcrafted spear or an arrow, the legality, the force majeure contract law is the sharp end. So, imagine the pencil or something sharp. And on the other side of this arrow is this beautiful feather. That's, to me, is good faith, mutual desire to enter into an agreement and say, hey, let's do great work together, let's talk. What makes a beautifully functioning relationship, or in this case, a beautifully functioning arrow, is the body that holds both ends. So what's a beautifully functioning relationship? To me, especially in the current climate of cultural awakening, This body of the arrow is designed through the principles of equity and power dynamic between institutions, i.e. presenters, and small and independent entities that are basically artists, managers, producers, and agents, all with this intent to reach and move audiences. And the 100 of us, or so actually there's about 50 of us here, in this virtual room today are the designers of this evolving arrow, gathered to rethink and reimagine. By the way, are there any general counsels or controllers or risk managers in the room? If so, please say hello in the chat. But the rest of us are probably here because you noticed something wasn't working, or something about a force majeure experience felt unjust, perhaps, and we want to do something about it. So as leaders in the arts, what is our ability? What's our mandate to bring this issue to the forefront of our discussions, like your discussions with your buyers, your artists, your managers, your producers, your general counsels, your state legislators? Lucky for us, there's been a number of industry-wide efforts that have already taken place over the past 4 to 5 months to think tank this and to move this needle forward. The thesis is this: the fallout from organizations canceling engagements by invoking force majeure without any compensation, or in some cases asking for the return of deposits, has led to disproportionate and devastating effects on the artists and small businesses that surround them, particularly in BIPOC communities. A $5,000 loss means something very different for an independent artist than it does for an institutional host. It doesn't mean there isn't loss on everybody's part. So our challenge is, how do we close that gap? How do we redesign this body of this arrow so that rather than the sharp end killing engagements and artists' well-being, are we able to decorate it with more feathers, with more conversations? How can this conversation be normalized in our community rather than penalized or shunned upon? Prior to COVID, the instances of either side of the contracting parties using this sharp end was probably limited to things like unforeseen travel related circumstances and natural disasters, which are now all the more common in the age of climate chaos. Then add COVID, civil unrest. So there's an urgency here, and if force majeure is a symptom, not a cause of what appeared to be a transactional and this sort of extractive practices that have persisted for decades, now is the time to have a serious look at designing a more equitable partnership between artists and institutions toward our shared values and goals, rather than focusing on, and I've seen this happen, how to make force majeure more ironclad, which may further polarize us.
That's great. Thank you, Rika. And the kind of framing that you're introducing of thinking about the force majeure contract as a space for dialogue around equitable partnership and shared risk. I know that's something that came up a lot in the Creating New Futures document that was a big part of a major part of your work when the pandemic first started. And I'm hoping you can share a little bit about your experience working on that document and in your reflections on building equitable partnership from the artist side.
That was to me, yeah?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you. And thank you everyone for being here and this great panel. So I kind of going from where Rika brought us to, I actually envision a future wherein our relationships are so trusting and trusted and decolonized and centered on justice that we don't need such a thing as a force majeure clause, because we would be in a relationship that, and a relationship system, like a myriad of systems of support that support discussion and change and shift. So that might be a little bit further down the track, right? So in the process toward that, how do we create agreements, create contracts, create force majeure clauses that are based on that shared equitable risk? Realizing, of course, that an artist whose gig is completely canceled under current force majeure industry standards might risk homelessness, might risk not being able to pay for their health care, might risk not being able to pay for their groceries for themselves and their families, and certainly might risk not being able to pay other artists who work with them, who then can't pay their health care, who then can't pay their rent. And the problem catapults, right? There's loss when force majeure is enacted on all sides. The box office or an institution loses something, an artist loses something, but what is not shared is the potential for harm and the immediacy of that harm. So, I worked on a section of the phase 1 Creating New Futures called Alternatives to Cancellation. So I also want to think about what those alternatives might be. I mean, there's a whole chapter in that phase 1 document. Please take a look at the whole document. It's an amazing executive feat of kind of the current state of our performing arts field, and Creating New Futures is currently deeply involved in phase 2. I'm not here representing anyone but myself, but I was part of Creating New Futures, currently am working in a group working on intersectional writers, which is another tool that might be used as a process whereby which artists might share power and risk, and where we might come into institutions with a kind of tool such as an intersectional writer that that describes the kinds of spaces and describes the rules of engagement that are commensurable with our work. And in the alternatives, if we can move toward alternatives that come from artists and communities, right? When all of the cancellations happened with me, there was no discussion. And there wasn't a discussion about how I thought maybe my work might be helpful in this moment, or how my work might be process-oriented rather than more product-oriented at the time. So I think that we can look to those discussions with artists and with communities about, rather than in a moment of cancellation, what the alternatives might be. Certainly, those answers are not always digital either, though that tends to be the trend now. But I think that there's a way in which we can move into alternative generative spaces beyond the digital that still meet our safety and our care standards, right, and protocols. And then also, as Rika said, it's such critical work right now that should be done in a conversation that includes presenters, artists, communities, funders. These discussions, we need to figure how we might work forward together, not only in this global pandemic that continues, but as Rika also mentioned, climate chaos is going to continually have more and more effect on us, on the indigenous lands that we all in the United States live, and on our ability at the current moment to gather. And how might our work then, rather than think of force majeure or these contracts as like separate from the world, how might our work in redefining force majeure and contracts and alternatives to cancellations, how might that actually relate to decolonization? How might that relate to strategies toward climate justice and liberation?
Oh, that's incredible, the way that you just shared that. And I think that there's so many deep connections to be made between the points that you're making around relationship and conversation and partnership and the larger decolonization and climate justice work that we're all trying to do. I mean, it can often feel like these contract terms are often the business and legal land when they're all so intricately tied into all of this other work that we're trying to do, and taking it holistically actually really helps so much. So Andre, I want to direct the next question to you. So, you know, Rika and Emily really laid a wonderful groundwork of how valuable relationships, transparency, and honesty are to building equitable partnerships, but there are also incredible challenges to embracing this work, particularly for presenters and producers and other arts workers, both logistically and also culturally within their organizations. There's a lot at play there. So I'm curious if you can talk a bit about some of the ways you're seeing change happen and other reflections. I mean, you and Rika, I think all of us actually were all part of the APAP Force Majeure um, working group, and you played a large role in the writing of the document. And so any thoughts you'd like to share on that as well, I know we'd love to hear.
Yeah, thank you. And just sending love to everyone who's here. We're in like month whatever of pandemic. I know we've all got personal, professional challenges like swirling all around us. So it's just lovely just to spend a few minutes with known friends and new friends and just having a real conversation. So thank you everyone for making space. Thank you to all the comments that have come up and the questions thus far. I have a couple things to say. And one of the things I want to say is, or acknowledge, is like, I think conversations around money, maybe not for everyone, but for some of us, are just like hard and fractured because they're so built into like the, I don't know, just some of the negative aspects of the system or the culture that we live in. And I know that there are some great things that can happen with money and some of the freedoms that it can afford us if we have access to it, and generally just to resources. But I think money and our conversations around it sometimes make it really difficult for these to be transparent conversations when you have the parties at the table, whether it's presenters, producers, agents, managers, artists, community members, like that can just get in the way. So I think one of the tools or one of the practices that might be useful for some of us, and maybe I'll just speak for myself, some of the tools that I'm working on are just getting more comfortable about being so honest about all the economics of a situation, because I feel like once that is on the table, it becomes like so much easier just to be real about everything else. And not everything has to happen. Maybe not all engagements were meant to occur in the land where I am, and that's okay, because there are other people who can maybe support that, who are just down the street or close by or a state over, and that's okay. It's all about getting the right engagement in the right place at the right time. And we're all stewards to that, as the artists, as the venues, as the managers and the agents. So maybe I just wanted to acknowledge it. Like, I think it's tough for some of us to like navigate conversations around money. And I think just getting better about that and just being honest, like, this is part of the system we're in. So let's let having an equitable situation drive it, and we'll figure out how to work around or through the money thing. So like, I hope that's the next book, is like tools about honesty around the money in this particular world. Into my space as a presenter and a producer, it's one of the things I think about is like, as an organization, it's maybe helpful for us to consider where we are in the arts world or in the arts spectrum, and what our organization is about, and what is our balance between flexibility of shifting vision and mission and flexibility of resources. I don't think it's always like this, but sometimes smaller organizations can be nimble and can understand that major changes are happening in the field, and their values can evolve like overnight sometimes. But on the flip side, those organizations might not have the resources to be as flexible. So when we talk about all of a sudden there's $5,000 on the table, they're like, well, I guess like 2 people aren't getting paid this month or something, and so, which is different than, a bigger institution that maybe has a little bit more flexibility with the resources, but it's tougher to shift those values overnight. And so I think all of us trying to find within our organizations where we are and what that balance is, and being honest about that can make it easier to get to the next situation or to the next like evolution of values. For our organization where we are and our size, you know, we're small, maybe creeping up to like mid-size arts organization. We've found that we can shift and evolve our values very quickly with our community, with our staff and our board, but our resources are much smaller. And so something that I've done is try to figure out how we can have more equitable engagements, but just do less of them, but they get better, right? You know, I'll just be real. I used to be caught up in like doing as much stuff as possible. And in that probably lost better support of artists and better engagement of those artists with the community where I live. And I just realized that was just like a mistake and mistakes that we were making. And so we've really slowed it down, you know, in the last like 2 to 3 years. This is even pre-pandemic. And now in the quiet of the pandemic, I think we've been able to get a little bit more thoughtful about how we're going to come out of this situation and how we're going to take care of artists and take care of our community. So that's just like a lesson of like me and our team growing up. But I'm sure there are others out there in a similar situation. And then I think of, you know, because the University of Iowa is in our town, and I think of our friends down the street at Hampshire Auditorium, where I look at their resources and I'm like, oh, like, sweet, like, let me just like live in your closet. Like, I could do so much in this closet, you know, like, just give me a few dollars. But, you know, while their values, I think, are really strong, and that these are my friends and my partners, I think it's tougher for them to shift the value system when we think about force majeure, when they have to go to a university lawyer within the depths of the University of Iowa, who's probably a really good person, but, you know, just isn't seeing the world the way that Hampshire is seeing the world. And so it's going to take them some years to figure it out. However, you know, there are changes that they can make. And something that's happening in APAP's review process, and with all the review processes, force majeure is like breaking contracts up into stages for artists. And so it's not just like show happens on November 30th. And if it doesn't happen, you know, it's like, that's it. Like it's all off the table, but more that there are stages from the conversation of engaging with an artist in maybe several engagements that lead to this, you know, mythic show that we've grown up with. And maybe the show is just one part of many things that are happening. And sometimes there might be a adverse situation like a pandemic that means we only got to stages 3 and 4, but there was engagement with the artist in the community, and there was, you know, compensation for that, so the artist can continue to sustain. And so that is something that I think a major institution can take on. And a lawyer, you know, in that big university tower, just like, okay, cool, like we're doing stage 1, 2, 3, and 4, and so it doesn't even stop them. They're cool with it, you know. So I think there are things that these bigger institutions can do. And the last thing that I'll say is, you know, Hampshire in our particular place in Iowa is, you know, it's a R1, like, you know, public university. And so they're not only answering to the big institution, but they're answering to the Board of Regents of the state of Iowa. And in the state where we are, sometimes that Board of Regents may or may not be in support or like, you know, getting the university and the university's values. And so there might be tension there, but maybe not. But a private institution might have even more flexibility, you know, even on the university level, and they might be able to kind of like lead the way with values so that the president and the provost of the public university start to see, oh, this is the path that we need to be going on. And all of a sudden the conversation with their arts programs and their presenters on campus becomes a little bit less strained and maybe more collaborative.
That's great. That's awesome, Andre. And I think what you're saying about shifting the language away from performance on November 3rd to this engagement structure, I think is a great segue into how funders really are part of this conversation as well. Because as you said, it's never just one individual at an institution who has all of the power in order to make change. Everyone is responsible and has a different set of resources, and has, I think you used this language yesterday, has a different place in the solar system in terms of like where they're coming from. So I'd love to hear from any of you that might want to jump in on this. You know, how can funders support this change? And like, what are the challenges there that you're seeing from your various corners? And where can they be supporting this looking a little different in future? Maybe Rika or Emily?
Sure. I think for funders, funding organizations who bring artists into their communities, how can we better align our understanding of the metrics of the services that have been delivered, and where and by whom? There is an increasing number of folks who feel that the engagement begins the day we sign the contract, right? So there's a notion that the engagements are broken down into, different chapters, like we said. But really, when does it begin? Does it begin on the day we sign the contract? And I think for those of us who have run artists organizations, we know this to be true. And in creating new features document, I've seen this topic explored in depth with case studies. And so there is a great deal of open-mindedness and transparency that's needed from all sides to redefine and really put it under the microscope and say, how are we honoring an artistic process very authentically? And what are the stages of work involved to make the engagement real? In the same vein, some folks have also started to look at what a timed force majeure clause looks like. Curious to see if Emily or Andre have thoughts on that, but this clause would have specific expenses paid for in the case of force majeure based on the timing of the force majeure incident and where it happens in this advanced timeline leading into the actual engagement. And to me, the advanced expenses should not just be about non-refundable airfare. It's everything that goes into planning a successful production, including time spent. Mm-hmm. So again, I think for funders, are we in conversations together to align that understanding? And the last thought here is, with this virtual engagements happening across the field, I think there is, and more presenters investing in pre-recorded or filmed content. There's, I think, a much better understanding that the culminating event is only phase 10 of this very rich multi-pronged process. And I think the same is true for live engagements as well. And each phase builds upon the next. So the notion that the artist shouldn't be compensated unless they successfully flew on the airplane and, God forbid, in the midst of protests and hurricane and multiple layers of PPE and took a bow in front of an audience just seems so almost dishonoring of the artistic process and maybe short-sighted. So I'd love to see how that in post-vaccine world can be more equitably distributed, and how can we look at that differently?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, go ahead, Emily.
Yeah, I love those thoughts, Rika, and I love talking with our funder partners because I have really good ideas. And I think partly, like, just going off of what you were just talking about, Rika, like how do we reorient this system that actually, like, how do we bypass sometimes this that money has to go in this kind of fairly patriarchal system where it has to like go through this overhead institution and then trickle down to artists, right? Like, what if we could reorient that completely, and then we are funding artists' lives and process, and we're shifting really where it does take a realignment of values, and it does take a deep undoing of those colonial and patriarchal systems that we've inherited, right? And then secondly, I think funders need to take a look at how they might advocate and how their relationships, the folks they have deep relationships with, might advocate and start to create the true possibility for UBI and universal healthcare. And both of these ideas, like completely reorienting the system and then creating UBI and universal healthcare in what is called the United States, are monumental. But we're not going to make monumental shifts unless we monumentally shift, right? We have to like do that work together. And these are areas where I think funders can really, can really help to guide that change. And another one is related to, I love, Andre, how you talk about evolving values in relation to institution size. And certainly there's process to this, and there's process with institutions. And you talked about, the shifting timelines and sometimes the issues that larger institutions might have in shifting their values, right? In accordance to the timelines that we might want. But I think funders can help here too. And something that funders might be able to do on the quicker term than those first two ideas I had is and it's a radical idea, but how can funders right now actually stop funding institutions and organizations who are clinging to those unjust systems? We know some institutions want to change and want to do this work. We also know some actually don't. Some actually want to reinforce their institutional dominance. Some want to, or don't know how to, untether themselves from their white supremacist roots and their settler colonial normativity. And so some institutions, a really good example of this, I'm trying to find a good example in the performing arts field, and maybe someone can put it in the chat. Like a good example in the museum field, for example, is an institution who, even though NAGPRA has been in effect for 30 years, even though Indigenous communities across what is called the United States have actively voiced again and again that we as nations want not only our belongings, but our ancestors back. We don't say bones in this context, but just for a general knowledge, I'll share that now. Like institutions that hold on to the bones of our ancestors, even though we know that that is an incorrect and racist practice, those institutions should not be funded anymore, right? Like that's a good step to maybe start to shift those institutions. So I don't know the correlating example in the performing arts field, but we absolutely know there are some organizations that need a little more than a gentle shove, perhaps, in that right direction. And I know that there need to be benchmarks that are created to guide this process. It's not the decision-making power of the funders. It's, again, a conversation with artists and presenters and funders and community about what are these benchmarks toward that guide us away from the unethical behavior, and what are the benchmarks that determine what are the organizations that aren't meeting those benchmarks. I think that can really, it's more so, there's a problem sometimes when funders put work towards something, it can become a trend. We can't have decolonization and justice be a trend, right? So I'm just considering what does like shifting funding away from organizations who do not move toward decolonization and justice and liberation, what might that open up? What space might that open up? And what new pathways might come into our purview then?
Yeah, I want to really say how much I appreciate Emily really going there and saying the thing, because it's, I feel like that's a hard thing to put out there in a kind of a mixed room. And I think it's true. I mean, there's certainly, this is hard work, and it's sensitive for the reasons that Andre mentioned earlier around talking about money is hard. We need to be generous in that space. We also need good faith, and good faith isn't always there. So I think that looking at what are the levers, to that it is also, it's, how can I say this? I would say it's more important to take care of those who are facing injustice than to assume that everyone is coming with the best intentions. We need to take care of the people who have been harmed first. Yeah, and I, clocking that it's 8:42, I want to take a little bit of a pivot for our next few minutes before we open it up to question, to move into the kind of immediate things that all of us in this community on this call can do, not aspirationally, in future, but really tangibly right now to move us in a better direction. Because I do think that there can be this sense of, well, it's just so big and it's going to take a long time. And while yes, of course, this is going to be an evolving process, there are things you can do today, tomorrow, to move the ball forward. I want to give a quick shout out so that we don't forget that the APAP Force Majeure Working Group is releasing a document that APAP is going to be disseminating far and wide in the coming months. That's really meant to be kind of a leveraging tool for having robust conversations around equitable partnership. It's moved away from force majeure as the narrow focus to this larger issue of relationships between parties and having them be just and equitable and reflected in the contract. So just to say to keep an eye out for that, and it has some great suggestions as well of a few immediate things that folks can do. But yeah, would any of you like to take a shot at, some offerings? I mean, I think Emily, you just did such a beautiful, a really helpful thing in showing, like, from one particular angle of the funder what needs to be examined, and from I mean, maybe Rika, I'll actually ask if you don't mind reflecting on this from the independent producer space. What is a place to start in moving this forward?
Well, like I said earlier, so in the past 5 months, there's been this incredible think tanking that's been going on. And in creating new features document alone, there are literally hundreds of pages. The purpose of APAP sort of rolling out this document, and I'm lucky to be a co-chair in that process, along with Michael Reed from ASU Damage, and you guys in the amazing group, to think about this invitation to ethical and equitable partnership. And it's really an invitation right now. And that may be phase one. Like, we're not asking people to be ethical today, which actually we are actually asking you to be ethical today. But how do you become ethical today? In creating this document, and it's in its final stages, it really became evident that in some of the presenting circles that, the reaction is very much like, that is wonderful, but we're not ready. That is amazing. I believe it, but my general counsel is never going to go for it. It's going to take years. We get it. It's going to take years, right? But that's the work that we're starting now. So it's very important to emphasize that, yes, there's actions to be taken now, which I'll maybe summarize in a bit, but it's also part of this long journey that we're going to be in together. So, I think redefining performance, quote unquote, as quote unquote engagements. When does the engagement start? Redefining stages of work. Consider redefining stages of work. And therefore diversifying payment structures for artists, producers, agents, and managers. Advocate for a greater transparency around fees. Let's have discussions about it. Let's not be shy about it. And Andre, it is hard to talk money, but that's essentially what we're talking about when it comes to equity. Adopt the use of terms like first payments rather than deposits. Sarah McCarthy threw a really great question in the chat. How do we have this conversation with university presenters or local municipalities that insist advance payments / deposits are not compatible with the rules of institution? Happy for anybody to take that question on, but that's the thing. It's like these shifts in language and understanding is the first step. Let's talk about it. And so, with the producers group, I think that it's important to center this conversation, not as a contractual conversation, but as a relationship building conversation. That's going to impact the entire field.
Oh, thank you, Rika. I think I might with that go ahead and I want to pull in some information in the chat and then open up the floor for questions. So I'm gonna pull some things in here, but in the meantime, if you have a question you'd like to offer, if you can use the raise hand tool, just so in case I'm not seeing your face, I don't miss it. That would be great. I want to uplift something that Lindsay shared about destigmatizing pushing back on cultural clauses, because yeah, I mean, I think a lot of this too is the kind of barrier to entry, I think, for a lot of folks in these legal conversations. You know, I think there's even times when I've been in conversation with folks on the other side of a table that's like, well, I have to put that in there. You know, boss's boss of the boss says it has to be in there. Sorry. And we don't actually even know what we're agreeing to on paper. So yeah, I think that that's a great point that, and I think this is actually connecting to something, Rika, you shared yesterday, which is just examining the contracts you're using as a place to start before you have a specific conversation with an individual presenter, artist, et cetera, wherever you're sitting, and just kind of going, okay, what is my place to start? And, you know, where can I pull in the best information and knowledge from other sources? Um, Also, just uplifting something, Andre, you shared yesterday, is the real power of leaders in the field in creating a domino effect. You know, of, oh wow, that entity just did it, so you know, I'm encouraged to as well. So I think that as a field, I think that there's more and more energy moving, I think, in this space, in a space of pressure, loving pressure to move this forward for everyone's sake. And I'm hopeful that if we all move forward from our corner of the world, that we can move the ball forward. Um, questions? Questions from folks?
As we wait for a question, I just want to add in what you were just saying, also thinking about artists in that process of shifting that language forward and being in that same, like you were talking about, Lindsay, artists being brokers and negotiators, and knowing that some artists don't know that you can negotiate a contract, or don't have experience in negotiating a contract, or much less a force majeure clause. And so there's like there's I don't know, there's processes there, and to I think to there's some learning capacity to shift. There's some acknowledgement that of understanding where different artists are at in their careers. And like, I'm always a little bit afraid of standardization, right? Like yeah. How do we go about this in a way where our clauses and our contracts and our engagements are, as we keep saying, are relational. And right now, as we talk about that, and as we talk about bosses, we're also talking about artists in that conversation, you know, artists of all stages in their career in that conversation. I think that's a little mind shift we need to do as well.
Absolutely. Well, I'm wondering too, since I haven't seen a hand specifically, I mean, this is a room of peers, and I know from the faces I'm seeing too, as well as those folks who I haven't had a chance to meet personally, that there's a wide range of expertise in this room. So I also want to offer, if someone feels like they have a case study that they kind of want to offer in the spirit of this conversation, I'd very much welcome you to offer it. And also from our panelists too, if you wanted to dive into a more specific example. Yeah, go ahead, Andre.
Yeah, just a perspective from kind of presenter world. You know, I'll continue to talk about my own failures. When the pandemic hit, we had to cancel one of our festivals that's been going on for a while. And I remember I was like, myself was like caught up in like the doom scroll of like the first like pandemic days, and everything was canceling, and you're like, what's happening to the world? And we canceled our festival. And I remember there were like, our accountant came to us and he's like, what's up with these like deposits? Like, are they coming back? And I like reached out to one of the artists to get the deposit back. And one of our co-curators was like, what are you doing? Like, why, like, we can't do that now. And I was like, oh shit. Like, like I like too was like caught up in it. Like none of us are, I don't think are immune. Maybe there are some perfect people on this call, but like it took me a minute, and my dear friend, co-curator in the community, like sat with me and he's like, look, these are like 4 artists who live in Philadelphia, and like that's $700 each to them that they're taking away from this after like the agent gets their piece. That's like rent for like next month while we're going through a period in which no one has any idea what the future holds. If we can even like go back to March, if anyone can like remember that. And the reason I bring this up is it's just coming back to the humanity of what's happening. Like we're talking about documents and agreements that we're making with people, which we need to do like as humans. Like we need to make agreements and like, I'm going to do this, you're going to do that. So we can be fair, but also remembering that there's humanity attached to it. And it's not just this legalese that we're caught up in, right? And it's okay to have the writing and it's okay to sign the document as long as we also understand the humanity that's on all sides of that document. And that was a good moment for me to like kind of get broken down to my elements and be like, okay, you need to slow down and just remember why you're doing this. And I think, like my board, it was a very stressful time for them. They're like, what are we doing? Everything's canceling. Part of our like model is like based on these events happening, right? And I remember being in one conversation with a board member and I said, part of our job as an organization is to support artists and the development of artists. And like most frequently that happens in a performance, but it's not always. Sometimes it's an investment in an artist who couldn't make it to this festival. And maybe they'll come back to the next one. Maybe they won't. Maybe we won't connect for another 7 or 8 years, but that's part of what we invest back into. And just like saying that aloud, the board member's like, yeah, cool. Yeah, I get it. Because we're talking about human stuff, right? And maybe not all board members could see that, but I think a lot could when we put it in those human terms.
No, I can't, thank you enough, Andre, for sharing that, because that's and I'll just say that this is something that I adore so much about the Creating New Futures document as well, is the honesty and the vulnerability about where we're all evolving. I mean, I was gut punched, just to share for myself, hearing in the Creating New Futures document how many artists, when they received cancellations, didn't even get a phone call for like $20,000 plus levels of work. And it made me challenge my own notion of even how, in my own practice, was I contacting every single artist who was going to be making a huge loss, or was I doing the same kind of point person, feeling overwhelmed in the moment? And there's so much to be. This was a real trauma that our field has been going through, and pretending like anyone walked through it with, perfection is just, that's not how any of this works. And I'm a huge fan of Adrienne Marie Brown and emergent strategy and her small is all, and that the definition of apocalypse actually being to uncover. So if what this moment can offer us is an uncovering of some of our failings and reveal ways that we've kind of had some moments of, oh, this is how I need to bring humanity back into this. I hope it does. Yeah. So I see we have about 3 minutes left. Lovely, wonderful panelists. Do you have any closing thoughts you'd like to offer before I wrap us out?
I think my kind of closing thought is, let's not wait. We all have like, let's start, or keep going, or start, or like, yeah.
I love that the dancer's moving. It's great.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. The conversation has started. So there will be a unique URL that's going to be attached to this new invitation to Ethical and Equitable Partnership Guide. And the official rollout is at APAP, but there will be announcements and activities leading up to it too. And this is one of them. So yeah, I invite you all to be part of the movement, if you will, and what will sure to be a multi-year process.
Great. I also just want to, as we wrap, point out Victor J's note here in the chat, which is right on. Yeah, I mean, I think that the question / reflection is, yeah, my sense of it is that it's right on the nose of those if then really deep specificity is I think so important to, because we're going to be, I think, balancing the legalese of it and the power balance of that and what capitalism and white supremacy are going to want to have us do with the humanity side of it, and that's going to continue to be a tension. So as much as we can spell things out in the contract, I think that's a big, if it's fair to say, lovely panelists, that's a big value, I think, coming out of today in our conversation.
Which then would also be reflected in the contracts, like, for example, contracts that then I have with other arts workers that I work with. I need to also think about equity and shared risk there as well.
Totally. Well, thank you, everybody. I want to give a huge thank you to Rika, Emily, and Andre for what you've shared, for your vulnerability, and for, frankly, being guinea pigs for our very first Producer Hub webinar. Thank you. And I want to encourage everyone that we have 2 more events coming up currently on the schedule. I imagine we're going to be adding more. The next one is on SAG and equity new media contracts. And the third is on climate justice and building a green new theater. And registration is open for that as well. Please sign up for the Producer Hub mailing list so you can keep posted. And as always, if you have any questions, contact info is on the little, there we go, little circle behind me. Check out producerhub.org. And thank you all so much for being here. There'll be a link to the video soon. And thanks, everyone. Sunshine, yeah, music. I'ma go get some time alone. We could go dancing.